Hi, Grant.
Hi, Kerry.
Well, I'm Kerry Howley with Reason Magazine, and you are?
Grant McCracken. I'm an anthropologist at MIT.
Well, Grant, thank you so much for joining us today. You are the author of Transformations, which I'm holding up to the screen. It's my favorite of the Grant McCracken products. We have a whole McCracken library here at the Howley Wilkinson household, but this is definitely my favorite. It's a really wonderful book about the expansion of the space for identity creation in our postmodern world. Is that a fair summary?
Sure, that's good. Absolutely.
And I think it's also a wonderful holiday gift. It's for anyone, contemplating a New Year's resolution.
I wouldn't go that far. I don't think anyone wants to see this under the tree Christmas morning.
Sure they do. Maybe someone in your life you think needs a transformation. Give it with a box set of Extreme Makeover or something.
No, absolutely. Good idea. We should bundle those together.
So there are many, many dimensions to this book, but one of the most interesting discussions, I think, is one about status competition. And this is kind of phrased in terms of class. I think one of the ways in which we affect our identities is we try to mold them to conform with the standards of a social class that we perceive to be above our own. And it's kind of constraining, it's kind of unidirectional, and it involves the margins coming toward the center. But I understand this isn't really what you don't think this describes the modern world very well. We've departed from this particular constraining way of forming our identity. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. I think this was the great engine of transformation from the early modern period onwards, and it's just I was just actually thinking this morning that if you look at the relative influence of reigning celebrities, you'd have to say Martha Stewart is kind of the old regime status transformation kind of person. But the person who's much more influential than she is Oprah Winfrey. And I don't know the Oprah Winfrey corpus down to the letter, but my sense is Winfrey really doesn't care about status at all. That in point of fact, she would take that sort of modernist or avant-garde point of view that says status is constraining and limits your expressive possibilities. And in any case, this notion of what used to be the great the magnetic north of our culture when it came to personal transformation is now a kind of a minority player.
Yeah, I think maybe we would define status a little differently. I mean, to say Oprah Winfrey doesn't care about status, do you mean status in terms solely of social class?
Right.
Because I guess I think that people care about status, but they care about, there's kind of this proliferation, this plenitude of different status dimensions in which you can care. So it's not just about social class. I can care whether I have the best memory for cultural products, whether I'm the best film buff, whether I'm there are many more dimensions on which to compete, and the old dimensions just don't matter to Oprah Winfrey the way Martha Stewart is this perfect example, and your descriptions of her in the book are amazing. This perfect example of someone who, behind the scenes, transformed herself from someone of humble origins to the perfect icon of WASP culture.
Yes. Yeah. No. I think capital status continues to come from the accumulation of capital of several kinds. Cultural capital, intellectual capital. But it doesn't come, I think, from social capital quite as much as it used to do. And that idea that you accrue social capital to the extent that you're able to emulate your social betters, that notion is really just not interesting to anybody, which, and the odd thing here for anthropological purposes is that it was just tremendously, it was obsessively interesting even after World War II, but certainly before and in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. It was as I say, the magnetic north for personal lives.
The magnetic north. So when do you see this transformation occurring? Exactly. Was there a decade?
Oh, I'm sorry, which transformation do you mean?
The diminution of class-conscious status as something just obviously desirable.
Right. I'm sorry. I'm not sure what the question is. Sorry.
So as you say, people used to be completely obsessed with class emulation, and we've seen that diminish significantly. Is this something that happened very gradually, or is it something that you see as quite recent?
Yeah. I mean, I guess we could say that the rise of a celebrity culture, we could plot that so that celebrity culture rises and a kind of status preoccupation diminishes. So now that people follow the lives of Brad and Angelina, they're none of them follow those lives for status purposes. But to the extent those lives are influentials, if it's a zero-sum kind of game, other kinds of influences have to have fallen into eclipse, and I guess the status actors would have been the victims of this scenario.
I see. You've been talking on your blog a lot about millennials, and I'm sure they fit into this mold of people who care really about the multidimensionality of status more than one single path. And you mentioned on your blog that you never hear millennials talking about themselves.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm sure that's some measure of my the extent to which I need to be better informed. But in the 90s, we had very clear spokespeople for Generation X, so-called. I mean, even that term comes from Copeland. And we just don't have that. I don't have that same sense of the millennial generation having people who have risen to help define it, help name it, help give it. And in the absence of those people, we're left with the likes of Fisk. No, not Fisk, but Pine, and what's his name, Gilmore, who give us a very different, I think, notion of what a millennial, give us their notion of what a millennial is, and they're almost certainly boomers, so that it's a couple, they existed at the remove of a couple of generations, and to the extent that term millennial and their book on millennials supplies our understanding of the generation, you can't tell whether millennials look at that book and language and say, yeah, close enough, that will do, or whether indeed they're just, keeping their distance from the whole thing. And we had some actually quite interesting comments on the blog where some people arguing, listen, this is the last generation in some manner of speaking. It's too various actually to take much interest in the possibility of a monolithic definition of itself in a single term, and so that really they're just leaving that to boomers to do what boomers will, which is to engage almost as kind of Victorian. Victorians engage in a kind of natural history where you label and you categorize, but point of fact, millennials themselves just don't care for the exercise.
Well, I'm a millennial, I think. I was born in 1981, which either makes me like a very young Gen Xer or a very old millennial. So let's say I'm like the grandmother of the millennials. But my sense is that the way that millennials are defined in the press is often through this filter of anxiety over technology. So whereas, if you are of a certain age, you just don't notice the fact that your life is defined by technology. It's not really part of your consciousness. But whenever you read a mainstream newspaper, it's like the life of a young person is totally defined by these technologies in a way that doesn't really ring true to me. It's just the way it appears from the outside.
Right.
It just comes off as very false.
Yeah, I think somebody actually, I think Tapscott proposed the term digerati to characterize as another way of talking about Generation Y. So that's very interesting to think that, because I guess that's the thing it looks as if, if we take Henry Jenkins at his word, and I think we have to, it looks as if with each successive generation, people get better at popular culture. And that popular culture is more and more mediated by technologies of several kinds. They are, I think, if we could generalize a bit to say that they're more and more participative, which is to say you don't master these technologies in the old manner, but you're more engaged by them. You're obliged to participate in them, and so if people are getting better at popular culture, they're actually getting better at them. They're getting more masterful in the way they handle the new media, especially. So that's, I guess that's maybe what gives some people. And then I guess the other thing that strikes out generational outsiders like myself is that thing that everybody comments on, and it's the ability of millennials to monitor many information streams at the same time without the kind of dissonance that it provokes in the likes of me. And that looks, I'm not sure quite what to call that, but it certainly looks, to the extent that those additional streams come from new media, it looks like a familiarity with and a skill at the new technologies.
And you would
possibly.
I understand it's kind of silly to talk about generations, but there are certain regularities, and from the outside, I would expect that kind of comfort with culture and with new media to engender a skepticism. But my sense is that millennials are actually quite a bit less cynical than Gen X. So to speak, Gen X is. There's a cynicism toward government power. There's a surly anti-authoritarianism that I really like, that I see as absent from people in my cohort or younger.
Right. And again, it's hard to know whether that's kind of an acquiescence or just a thoroughgoing distance. And if it's the latter, right? If it's the latter, then it's really not. One could then treat Generation X as the generation that really dug its heels in. Well, I guess we have. But you could say that Gen X did some of the work that allows Gen Y then to keep its distance and to make its choices and to, the battle in some sense has been fought and been won, and it gives Gen Y that opportunity to pick and choose as it will.
And to focus on the accumulation of social capital. I mean, as you say, that they're the best the best ever at understanding popular culture, and I do sense this feverish accumulation of cultural knowledge. So everywhere around me, I feel like there are status competitions based on who can be the most impressive sort of dump of musical knowledge, of film knowledge, of who can be a human encyclopedia referring to all of these different facts. Yeah,
which I have to say is thrilling for someone like me. I go to an academic cocktail party and still people of my generation, boomers, will say, of course we don't watch TV, or we do watch TV, but we never really pay attention. And as the sherry takes hold of them, they begin to demonstrate an astonishing mastery of Law and Order episodes going right back to the very beginning, which tells you that for this generation, popular culture continues to be a kind of guilty secret that they can't openly acknowledge. And so, and as I'm an anthropologist interested in contemporary cultures, there's just something weird about a culture that has declared a kind of embargo against the taking seriously of itself. That's not very well put, but you know what I mean. So it's great to see successive generations come along and just get over that entirely and say no. And in fact, I have a friend, a boomer, now passed actually, who said, you know, listen, and I think he would have said this in the late 90s. He said, listen, it's just time to stop calling it popular culture. It's just culture. It feels like we're on the verge of that accomplishment, which is, again, from an anthropological point of view, really terrific.
That's interesting. And this seems to relate to another theme of your book, which is this tension in all of human history between conformity and innovation. And the fact that, I mean, in order for humans to survive, there had to be room for small innovations, but there also had to be, of course, conformity so that one could learn about the innovations of the past. But for basically all of human history, there's been this incredible pressure toward conformity so that innovations were kept so far toward the margin. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that's certainly what we've seen happen. I mean, you know, corporations used to stand in opposition to innovation, and their idea was that for social and cultural purposes, they meant to be conservative, but for their own economic purposes, they meant to kind of turn the world turn themselves into their own kind of planet that created its own kind of weather system that gave them maximum control. And now they understand that that's impossible, that they're now obliged to keep up with and respond to a culture in turmoil. So yes, you know, we've got change of every kind. So, you know, you think about the people who helped get the scientific revolutions and the industrial revolutions started. Many of them were well-born. They were aristocrats or gentlemen of one kind or another. And the notion was, well, that's kind of the deal, that eccentricity and other kinds of experimentation and innovation and the ability to take leave of convention and orthodoxy of any kind or every kind, that was really the privilege of high-born people. And so, you know, the scientific revolution really comes from, you know, people who are well-born, and it's really been thoroughly democratized so that everybody now presumes to do what was effectively engage in what was a class privilege. So the number of people participating is astonishingly high. And now, reading recently that the number of requests for patent that have come into that now come into Geneva, the International Center, has gone up by 5,000%. And one of the reasons is that the number of patents coming out of India has jumped astonishingly. So, you know, as we see the second and third world sort of come online from an intellectual production point of view, the sheer number of innovations in the world becomes you know, the number grows astonishingly, and yeah. I mean, I was interested to see that, you know, we went through this entire presidential election now complete, and we listened to everybody talk on both sides talk about the importance of change, and not a single person seemed to me ever to talk about the possibilities that the new media open up to us. So, you know, we're still going to vote in the most conventional ways. We were going to collect funds, yes, using the new media and internet and other technologies to collect money. That was a good idea, but the idea that we might dismantle Washington now that we can canvass virtually everyone in the United States, that seems to have impressed no one. So there's still little pockets that are, for all the world, living in the, you know, kind of the 18th century, but the rest of the world is changing in almost as we look at it. So
yeah, I've always thought that the gender identity embodied in the president and the first lady was the most reactionary in all the culture. I mean, the idea that the first lady's job is to focus on children's literacy, I just always feel like it's a display of the way it used to be, but no one ever comments on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's.
And I should add that your discussion of gender identity and transformations is really wonderful and just very sophisticated. But back to the issue of accommodating innovation, it's interesting you should bring up the past election, because I've always thought of these issues in terms of nationalism. And so when you were talking about the way we need to invent tradition to accommodate innovation in a culture in which most people are just very hostile to innovation, I immediately thought of my time. I lived for a couple of years in Burma, which is a society that was taken over by the military in 1962. And when I first got there, I was subjected to just hours upon hours of what I thought was just Burmese traditional dance. If that doesn't really even make sense when you subject it to thought, because there's no coherent Myanmar culture. But the dance was very demure. It was very slow. It always involved just kind of parading women on stage and not a lot of movement. And about a year in, I was told that it was just a completely invented tradition that the government had brought into its ceremonies, which we had to attend. And I encountered one day on the beach, I was just kind of walking along the beach, and I encountered a actual folk dance, and there was a minority known as the Karen. They're Christians, and it was really violent and energetic and quite beautiful, and as different as you can possibly imagine from the calm, invented, sort of subjugated dance that was being paraded around as official. And clearly the idea was, we're taking over, but we're going to invent for ourselves a history so that this innovation doesn't really look like an innovation at all. It'll be what always was.
Absolutely, and as an anthropologist, that's familiar stuff for me. I mean, it's usually not accomplished, at the point of a gun or as the result of the imposition of military rule, but cultures, traditional cultures, are fantastically good at papering over even extraordinary changes, so that one is left with, in a couple of generations, no one knows that the world was ever otherwise, and I guess that's one of the signatures now of the West is not only are we changing, nobody has the power to get the genie back in the bottle. I think we're kind of in an intermediate moment where we have a kind of stop and go logic, where we have a sudden change, we adjust to that change, and then we have this notion of stasis, that the world's gone back to normal. And you could argue that this whole this question about what to call each generation and how to identify and define each generation, that's classically our attempt to get the genie back in the bottle, to say, okay, this generation will have a characteristic way of thinking about the world. Let's define what that is. We'll understand what these new rules are and how they change the world, and now we've returned to order. And I think that's that's the illusion that helps us live with the fact that, the thing that really struck me, I just found this out the other day. I was trying to chart the change between 1970 and 1980, and there are lots of really striking changes. The one that I think I identified, I have yet to kind of have a careful look at the political details here, but in 1970, no woman served as the head of state in any country internationally, and by 1980, 8 women had served in that capacity. So that we went from being, internationally a world where women didn't serve as heads of state to one in which, many women had. So, all which is to say, I guess, that you start to kind of keep track of all the ways in which we're changing. This notion that, okay, so these are millennials, is really just, whistling past the graveyard. We're just kidding ourselves.
But I bet quite a few of those women were in Asia, and that change, too, would have been cloaked in the idea of continuity, the idea of tradition. So Suu Kyi is a leader because her father was a revolutionary. So we're really going back to that. This isn't a revolutionary change. This is back to our past. This is back to tradition, which is part of the reason that Hillary Clinton obviously had some of her legitimacy.
And now we have a Kennedy coming up.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's a difference cloaked in sameness. I mean, I think, yes, the family name remains the same. You've got some sort of the operation of dynastic logic at work here, and that's all about how you make continuity happen. But when you change the genders of the gender of the participants, I think that's a difference that makes a bigger difference. And yes, you have the outward form of dynastic.
I completely agree. I mean, and I think people miss this. I think that the dynastic aspect is, in a sense, necessary. It's a necessary bridge. And so it is progress, because it's going to take a lot longer to get there if we don't have that particular bridge.
Yeah. It's
suspect.
A kind of a kind of cultural sleight of hand that allows us to do what we might not otherwise be prepared to do.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, it's interesting, isn't it? And I think in 100 years, people will look back at us and they'll see us kind of floundering in our attempts to kind of make manageable what it is to live in a wind tunnel of kind of innovation of every kind coming at us all at once, and all the sense-making apparati that intellectuals and the chattering classes have used to sort of bring order to the chaos that has always prevailed in Western societies, devoted as they were to pretty continual and thoroughgoing change, to the ferocious structural effects that came spinning out of the marketplace and out of the culture and out of creative circles. But at some point, that just falls. Well, I mean, I guess we're still trying to make that apparatus go. But it's kind of, to think about this as kind of an outboard motor. You can see, you can hear gears grinding and things and smoke rising, and it's not a pretty sight.
You can, but as you say, some things seem to remain so totally out of it, like the political system, or like healthcare. I mean, there are just certain aspects of society that seem kind of untouched by innovation to me.
Yeah.
And
you wonder whether...
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, on the healthcare thing, I was just talking to somebody who's actually who's good on this theme, and he said that he thought the healthcare system is so fantastically backward as an administrative system, and the American world is now so good at creating innovation and managed dynamism within an organization that Obama could actually fund the substantial reform of healthcare out of the savings he's able to extract from this worn-out system. So that it makes for a fantastic opportunity that the system is so backward. It actually gives
that it just can't get any worse.
Yeah, exactly. But you wouldn't have to raise a single tax dollar to make to double its and triple its efficiencies. Would actually could be funded from savings.
Wow.
That's not very well.
Yeah, another sector that seems to me incredibly bureaucratically stalled is I was talking recently to a guy who's writing a book about education, and when you start to think about the architecture of public education, I mean, sending children into these brick boxes where every day they have the same routine and they pledge allegiance to the flag. It just hasn't grown the way the rest of the economy has grown, the way the rest of society has grown, and it starts to look very. It just starts to seem so out of time in its own way. Yeah.
No, absolutely. That has been, and I think we can go back to our generational theme. It feels to me like some of that is just a reflection of how backward academics can be, and how backward they've been allowed to be. The fact that they're so little engaged by the world means that they can entertain. They really don't understand just what's happened on the outside, how quickly things are moving on the outside, how urgent some kind of structural reform in education has become. But more particularly, because they treat popular culture, as a guilty secret, as something that can't really be taken seriously, they're astonishingly ill-suited to the educational responsibilities with which we've charged them. and it means that they're bringing along people from Generation Y and trying to speak to them in a language that is embarrassed by the possibility of popular culture. I mean, that's just it means that the liberal arts are being starved from within in some sense. And not just the liberal arts, the professional schools as well are desperately out of touch with contemporary culture. And it makes them, everyone uses this comparison, and they usually do so hyperbolically, as a glib act of metaphor. But in point of fact, the academies are very monastic in the extent to which they are divorced from the world for which they're supposed to be preparing their students.
So what
anyway,
would
that's one of my favorite.
A liberal arts curriculum that took pop culture seriously, what would that look like?
Oh man, wouldn't that be just joyful? That would be, because all of the idea, first of all, for my own purposes, and this is another of my hobby horses, but I think you'd want to dismantle postmodernism, at least as a way of thinking about the world, as a way of knowing. It's been disastrously mistaken, and it's really cost us the ability to think about the new dynamism of contemporary culture. So that would be, I think, one's first act of office would be to say no more postmodernism. You can study postmodern things, and that's very interesting, and the sheer raggedness and turbulence and dynamism of the world, the stuff we've been talking about, that's all of it a postmodernist subject to be sure. But it feels to me you have to use the classic intellectual approaches established in and by the liberal arts, and that could be gloriously, so continue to read all of the things we treat as classics and think about how those ideas can be applied to the world in which we now live. That would be
right. Stop pretending that culture was something that happened a very long time ago.
Yeah. And they're fabulous resonances, right? You read Sir Francis Bacon, the great Elizabethan man of letters and politics and any number of things. His stuff applies fantastically well to what it is to live in a world like us and what it is one has to do to think about postmodernist topics. So, it would be... and again, perhaps it's a little like the health system. The system has been locked away from the possibility of reform for so long that maybe what we can hope for is somebody to come along and, in a wholesale act of reform, kind of get the system recalibrated in some way. That would be pretty thrilling. But and I guess really, if we think about this from a kind of an entrepreneurial point of view, it's a fantastic opportunity for somebody to take the internet and all the new expressive technologies and just start again. Just leave the universities be and just build institutions of higher learning online and
well, there would have
there.
To be a sort of wholesale rejection of accreditation schemes, I suppose. They would have to be an entirely alternative institution, which would be very exciting. I think you should start the Grant McCracken Institute for the Popular Arts.
Yes. Yeah, I would love to get involved. If there's yes, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking if anybody out there, is thinking about starting a university, I would love to take part. I guess we'd have to find another term, but that really is. And you're right, the accreditation problem is, but these things, as we know, can happen very quickly. In the moment that employers begin to, and graduate schools begin to understand that you can't refuse this new internet upstart without refusing some of the most gifted students, the very students you most want to have as part of your law school. That's the moment when things shift in a hurry. So I think it's possible. I'd love to take part.
Yeah. So I thought we'd talk a little, given that no journalist can write an article without using the phrase "in this economy," I didn't think we should have an entire Blogging Heads episode without discussing the economy and, given who we're talking to, the effect that it might be having on our culture. My sense from reading, say, the New York Times style section is that we're living in a period where the wealthy among us are kind of playing at thrift, where given the anxiety, real and imagined, surrounding the downturn, it's kind of like the wealthy want to participate. So we get articles on, like, how to throw an $80 dinner party or something, and this is how we all get together and retreat to hearth from our globalized but crumbling world.
That's a lovely idea. That this is the new theme, the end of century kind of. Yeah, no, indeed. No, it'll be really interesting. I mean, the kind of the privileged people playing at austerity is an interesting theme, but those who will be obliged by the unemployment and other more serious conditions will. This is kind of the big anthropological question. Do people just proceed quantitatively, which is to say, do they live pretty much the way they've lived to the present day, only they're just dialing back each subsequent purchase? Or does this kind of shift in from one consumption pattern to another consumption pattern actually encourage people to engage in qualitative changes so that they actually change the things they begin to buy and the way they think about buying? And, we've got, even before this crisis struck, we had a powerful movement on behalf of different kinds of consumption, and more to the point, the whole green consciousness thing is also kind of upon us and making a difference. And further to that notion we were talking about earlier, status transformation, to the extent that people are just less interested in conspicuous consumption and making status claims with their consumer goods, that too may enter into this. And so this could be the quantitative change that makes for a qualitative difference. And that difference, could really, you can see it sort of setting in train a whole set of changes, bowling pin-like. So even, I hear smart people saying, listen, we have a year of pain and a year of discomfort, and then we're out of this disaster. This isn't an economic disaster, it's just a kind of violent downturn, but we'll be back. The question is what happens when we come back, and things may have changed so substantially in those 24 months that we will be a very different culture coming back. So, and anthropologist is the last person to comment on these, chiefly because at least this anthropologist doesn't have access to the kinds of studies that would answer this question in any definitive way. Well, I guess it's always speculative, but I don't claim to have any clear sense of what's going on here. It's just structurally this is an interesting possibility for really thoroughgoing change.
My impression is that a lot of the empirical literature shows that consumption patterns remain remarkably similar through really pretty dramatic changes in income volatility. But I do think that the things you're talking about have to do with impulses that were already with us before the recession and are almost certain to come back stronger during the next year. I think that there's kind of a protective quality to kind of dropping out and saying these purchases are vulgar or participating in this is soulless, because it's quite stressful, I think, to participate in a materialistic society. It requires making all different kinds of decisions and mastering a system of rules that helps you decide which purchases are tasteful and that sort of thing. And to have a space to say, in this economy, it's quite vulgar to be making any of those purchases, I can see that being a comfort.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've done some work on this phenomenon called hominess, which is if you sit in people's homes, they'll tell you what is homey and what makes homes homey. And it really is anti-status, and it's anti-modernist, and it's anti a lot of things. But mostly, it's as close as many North Americans come to kind of dwelling on the moment and really living, one starts to use kind of Zen-like language here, for better or worse, but this notion that that one ought to or wants to kind of live in the moment, take stock of the pleasures of the moment, count one's blessings. All of those things are built into hominess. And so that could be something we see. I think we've already seen this happen, and this is one of the quiet revolutions that I think took place in our culture in the last 20 years. You think about the living room with the velvet rope. Right? This is one of the great oddities of our culture. It's, you make your living room, if you have a middle-class income and a middle-class home. Traditionally what you did was made your living room perfect. Everything was expensively appointed and perfectly, appointed. And then you would rope it off because you wanted to keep it pristine. You had made it, you were now ready for inspection. You are now ready for ceremonial scrutiny, but only if you roped it off, so that only the family dog went in there, and only because he just didn't know any better. And what's happened the last 20 years is this, again, creatures of privilege, the middle class, families with middle class incomes have said, oh, screw that. Let's get rid of this living room. And what we'll do is open the kitchen up to both the dining room and the living room, and we'll have now this one great room called a great room, and that's I think that's Americans kind of voting with their interior design. I tell you, I mean, it's interesting. If you ask women to say why they were happy to say goodbye to their dining rooms, they said, "Listen, those dining rooms turned me into servants in my own home. We would have people over for dinner." At the very moment the conversation got interesting, I'd be obliged to ferry plates out and food back, and I was always being at a distance to the occasion that I'd created. And the point of this great room is now to make everybody present to not just the serving of the food, but to the preparation of the food. So everybody's kind of sitting at that island in the middle of these big kitchens. So that, it's a completely different model of sociality, much less interested
and it seems to relate, in the book you talk about the way we now have license to change our identities in public. So whereas Martha Stewart kind of retreated and emerged Martha Stewart, Madonna could just keep changing, or Courtney Love could change on stage. It seems like in the house you used to have a space where you were cooking, and then you had a space where you were hosting, but now they're kind of all integrated. They're one, or they're fluid. You can go back and forth.
Yeah. When you think about Goffman's notion of front stage and backstage, you've nailed it exactly. That idea that you present yourself on a public stage, and that you have moments privately where you're allowed, the green room, where you're allowed to kind of prepare yourself for your moment of self-presentation. That's really gone now. You let people into these private zones. Now, it turns out that people use these for status purposes, as I guess they will. And I had one woman tell me that when she went to the dinner party of one of her friends, she said, it's kind of like you're going to a cooking show, because the woman whose great room this was would be beautifully turned out, and she's illuminated by halogen lights, and she's using all-clad pots and pans, and the whole thing has this kind of theatrical quality. And it is all about the performance of the self. But what's interesting is the point you've just made is that, that private space and those private moments of anxiety and preparation are all gone. It's now, that's, for anthropological purposes, when a culture does that, when you take the Victorians or anyone in the 18th and 19th century knew all about this front stage, backstage sort of distinction. 20th century, it was reigning, it controlled public lives and private lives in a substantial way. To think that we've actually got rid of that distinction, it just tells you that we are, again, changing at light speed. So I'm not sure where I was going with that, but
we're not going anywhere. We're just talking. Well, Grant, thank you so much for coming on. I hope you'll come on again. We can invent a tradition of Grant McCracken dialogues, and we'll create a history of you.
Kerry and Grant. Kerry and Grant, please. Very good. Thanks. It's my pleasure, Kerry.
Thanks
so much. It was really a pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.